under the flickering streetlight of a nearly empty East Haven parking lot. A black woman in plain clothes stood still, her hands calmly visible, her eyes focused. The cold air made her breath visible, but her composure didn't waver. Behind her, a white police officer approached fast, one hand already resting near his holster, the other pointing. "Hey." What are you doing here?" she replied evenly. "Just walking home." But that wasn't enough. "ID. Now." She reached slowly into her coat pocket. But it didn't matter. Within seconds, he had slammed her against the cold brick wall, her shoulder hitting with a dull thud. Arms twisted behind her. Her face stayed calm. Too calm. The dashboard cam on his cruiser blinked red, recording every second. Officer Bradley Rigg didn't ask more questions. He didn't read rights. He didn't care. She was black, alone, and walking at night, his instincts told him that was enough. What he didn't know, what he had no clue of, was that the woman beneath his knee wasn't just another bystander. She was Special Agent Camille Warren, FBI, and her entire assignment, approved months ago at the highest levels, was to expose racial bias and excessive force within the very police department. Officer Rigg was sworn to protect. He'd just handed her the one thing she couldn't fabricate: real-time proof. And he had no idea he'd become the case. For months, Camille had walked these streets in silence. She had nodded politely to the officers who didn't bother learning her name. She had seen stop and frisks that weren't logged. Teenagers searched without reason. Threats whispered through clenched teeth. She had heard, "You people used," like it meant nothing. And now, tonight, without knowing who she was, they gave her the evidence she needed, raw, unedited, undeniable. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about exposure. Because when the law is used as a weapon against the very people it's meant to protect, someone has to be willing to step into the fire, not just to survive it, but to document how hot it really burns. This wasn't just an illegal stop. It wasn't just another case of mistaken identity. It was the moment a white officer slammed a black woman against a wall, unaware she was the one person in the city with the power, the authority, and the mission to bring his entire system down. And when the dust cleared, only one question would remain: would justice stay blind, or finally open its eyes? Camille Warren had been preparing for this assignment long before her boots ever hit East Haven soil. She was recruited not because she was the loudest or even the most decorated agent in the bureau. She was chosen because she could walk into hostile rooms and still be underestimated. That was her gift and her weapon. What the brass wanted wasn't noise. They wanted a record, evidence, not hearsay, but hard data patterns of abuse, off-the-book stops, intimidation that never made it to IA. The mission wasn't about making headlines. It was about pulling back the curtain. And Camille knew, in a town like East Haven, the curtain was heavy and nailed down tight. The first time she walked into the precinct, undercover as a civilian liaison for a fake city audit, the temperature in the room dropped. The front desk officer barely made eye contact. One sergeant asked if she was with probation. Another joked, "Must be a diversity hire from City Hall." She smiled, said nothing, and kept her eyes open. Every detail mattered. Every misplaced smirk, every folded report, every cop who looked at her too long or not at all was part of the profile she was building. East Haven wasn't a war zone. That's what made it dangerous. It was clean, quiet, well-funded. The kind of town where cops waved to school buses and grocery store clerks offered discounts to officers. But underneath the charm was a playbook as old as policing itself. Target the kids who don't blend in. stop cars without cause, file vague incident reports with enough wiggle room to justify anything. Camille knew it wouldn't be obvious. Racism never wears a badge and says hello. It lingers in the language. It hides behind reasonable suspicion. It gets buried in paperwork. She spent weeks walking the streets, learning the routes. She memorized the officers' shifts, their routines, where they stopped for coffee, who they pulled over the most. She volunteered at the local youth center and listened to kids describe being followed home. She sat in court and watched how quickly charges were pushed through without real evidence. She reviewed public records late at night, looking for names that repeated. One kept coming up, Officer Bradley Rigg. The man was a walking cliché of unchecked power. Tall, broad, always first on scene, always last to file. Camille flagged his cases one by one. Excessive force allegations, none substantiated. Body cam issues, technical malfunctions. Minority suspects over 80% of his arrests. And still, no disciplinary action. Rigg was protected. Camille knew if she wanted to pull the thread, he was it. But she couldn't provoke it. Not yet. She had to wait for what the Bureau called a natural interaction. Something organic. Something undeniable. Something like what happened in that parking lot, where Rigg made his own choice, on his own time, with his own assumptions, and now Camille had him. Still, she played the part. After the incident, she let herself be detained. No resistance, no protest. She gave a fake name linked to a secure alias, one the Bureau had created weeks prior. Rigg brought her into the station, logged her as uncooperative, but didn't charge her. There was no cause, no evidence, just bruises and silence. She walked out 43 minutes later without fanfare, but with everything she needed: the footage, the arrest log. The bruising, all of it, now had a file number. The very next day, Camille resumed her cover. Business as usual. The police didn't realize they had triggered the audit themselves. What came next would be a methodical takedown, legal, clean, undeniable. No grandstanding, just facts. And Camille was ruthless when it came to facts. She met with internal contacts and submitted the first preliminary report under her Bureau codename. She cross-referenced arrest records, examined citation data by race and income level, and spotted disparities so wide they were impossible to ignore. In 1 month, black drivers were 5 times more likely to be searched than white drivers, but less likely to have contraband. Hispanic teenagers made up 11% of the population, yet 38% of juvenile curfews stops. Camille dug deeper and deeper, compiling numbers, names, patterns. She wasn't just collecting stories. She was building an indictment. What made it worse, what made it personal, was how predictable it had all become. One of the kids from the youth center, a 16-year-old named Deshaun, told her he had a game. She went, sat in the bleachers, watched him score 2 goals, and smile so big his whole face lit up. The next morning, she saw him sitting in a holding cell when she walked past the precinct. Officer Rigg had stopped him for appearing lost in a white neighborhood. Camille asked to speak with him, played the role of liaison. Rigg didn't care. He was acting squirrely. He said, didn't answer questions fast enough. The boy had nothing on him, no charges filed, but he'd spent 6 hours behind bars. No call home, no record. It was routine. That night, Camille didn't sleep. She called in another memo to the Bureau. This wasn't isolated. It was procedural, and it was protected from the top down. Even the chief was on record during a press conference months earlier, claiming that East Haven had 0 tolerance for misconduct and a model community police partnership. Lies. Beautiful. Polished. Camera ready, says. Camille started sending anonymous tips to local journalists. Small details at first, patterns that looked like civic audits. Not enough to point back to her, just enough to stir public curiosity. The headlines started coming: use of force complaints on the rise. Youth center reports increased stops of minority teens. Broken body cams, coincidence, or cover-up, the precinct noticed. One officer joked. "Guess we got a whistleblower," Riggs said. "Probably one of those leftist watchdogs trying to make a name." No one suspected the quiet woman who sat in meetings with a notebook and a neutral smile. That was her power. That was her edge. And then, just as Camille was readying her first full report for FBI review, everything shifted. The mayor's office announced a randomized audit of city police records, citing transparency and community trust. Camille recognized the timing. This was pushback. Someone inside the department had caught wind of the investigation, and now they were trying to frame it as their own idea. If the city moved first, they could control the narrative, spin the numbers, cherry-pick the findings. It would neuter the whole operation. Camille had to move faster. She contacted her handler and requested escalation. Full intervention. It was risky, but the alternative was allowing the department to sanitize the data before it reached daylight. The Bureau hesitated. More time. They said, more evidence. But Camille was already watching it slip away, so she made a decision. She leaked the body cam footage from the night officer rig, slammed her into the wall, edited for her protection, but clear enough to show brutality and the lack of justification. She sent it anonymously to an independent watchdog group with ties to the press. Within 48 hours, it had 500,000 views. Now the city couldn't pretend it was in control. Now, the real story had begun. The footage hit the internet like a dropped match in dry grass. Within hours, social media lit up with outrage. A black woman thrown against a wall by a white officer. No weapon, no struggle, just pure force, and the way she stood still after, without flinching, only made it more haunting. People started asking, who was she? Why wasn't she speaking out? Where was the department's statement? The city scrambled. The mayor issued a vague tweet about prioritizing transparency. The police chief promised a swift review of department protocols, but none of it addressed the actual violence. None of it named what everyone had just seen: a white officer slamming a black woman against a wall, because he thought he could. Inside the precinct, suspicion thickened. Officers whispered. Desks fell silent when Camille walked in. She could feel the shift, but she played her role, took notes, answered questions, smiled. Rigg, for his part, acted like nothing had changed. If anything, he was louder, made more jokes, got more aggressive on patrol. One evening, Camille followed him off the record. She knew his beat, knew where he liked to prowl. And that night, he made a stop that changed everything. A black teenager, maybe 16, riding his bike home from a fast food job. Rigg pulled him over for no rear reflector. Dashcam later showed the kid had one, but that didn't stop Rigg from making him empty his pockets. Sit on the curb, answer rapid-fire questions about where he was going, where he worked, who he lived with. Camille recorded it all. The teen's name was Jalen. She met with him privately later, told him she was part of an oversight team investigating patterns of abuse. Jalen hesitated, said his mom told him never to talk to police. Camille nodded, said that's why she wasn't one, not the way they knew it. The next day, Camille filed an internal memo requesting Rigg's suspension based on repeated violations of department protocol. She attached video evidence, Time stamps, body cam inconsistencies. Her supervisor at the bureau warned her, "It's getting too hot. You're blowing your cover." But Camille had seen enough. The next fire started not from a screen, but from a file. A whistleblower from within, records anonymously slipped Camille a red folder. Inside complaint files that had been buried, one after another, all involving Rig, all suppressed. One showed a woman alleging sexual misconduct during a night stop. Another was from a Latino father whose son was hospitalized after a rough detainment. Camille cross-checked the report dates with city data they never existed in the official log. It was systematic erasure. She compiled a dossier, not just on Rig, but on the entire East Haven command chain. Who signed off? Who failed to report? Who handled the reviews that led nowhere? It was damning. And with the public already watching, Camille knew this was the moment to move. She called for a formal hearing public, not internal. The Bureau agreed. Rig was summoned, along with the chief, several senior officers, and the city attorney. News crews lined up outside City Hall. Protesters gathered. Some held signs with Camille's image from the leaked video. She didn't flinch. Others said, "Believe what you see." The hearing opened quietly. The city attorney tried to keep the conversation procedural. Camille didn't let him. She opened with a statement that no one forgot. This isn't about a single officer. It's about the fact that he thought he'd never be held accountable. She played footage after footage. The body slams, the baseless stops, the scared kids. She read emails, internal ones from officers, begging to be reassigned because they didn't want to work with Rig. She showed timestamps from missing footage files, showed how reports were altered after review. Then she dropped the final card. Rig's training evaluation from 5 years prior, flagged for impulse control, marked for follow-up psychological evaluation. That follow-up never happened, because the person responsible for scheduling it, the current chief. Gasps rippled through the room. The city attorney objected, said it wasn't relevant. Camille just asked the audience, "If it's not relevant to you, ask yourself who it's always been relevant to." For the first time, Rig looked nervous, but that wasn't the end. Because the next person to speak wasn't Camille. It was Jalen. He'd agreed to testify anonymously at first, but when he stepped up to the mic, he gave his name. He told the room what it felt like to be treated like a suspect for biking home from work, how Rig searched him while laughing, how he was told to watch himself in this neighborhood. Jalen's voice cracked once. Then he said something no one forgot. "If she hadn't been watching, who would have believed me?" Camille sat still, said nothing. But inside, she knew this was the moment the story turned. Outside, the protests grew louder. But inside, the message was clear. Rig was no longer just one bad cop. He was a symbol of a department built to protect its own. In the days after the hearing, Camille received a dozen requests for interviews. She declined them all. She hadn't done this for airtime. Instead, she met with the Bureau's legal counsel and filed her full report. 32 pages of policy failure, misconduct, and cultural rot. She recommended indictments, firings, community reparations. She didn't ask. She demanded. And then came the fourth ignition point. The city tried to retaliate. They leaked Camille's name, her FBI status, her assignment, framed it as overreach, called her a Fed posing as a civilian. Headlines split. Some praised her, others accused her of entrapment. But the footage had already done the work. The public had seen the truth before they were told how to feel about it. Camille didn't run. She held a press conference short, direct. She said, "The only thing more dangerous than police brutality is a system that teaches officers they'll never be punished for it. That ends today." Reporters asked if she'd continue the investigation. She smiled. "I already have." The twist wasn't just that Camille was FBI. It was that she'd been watching them long before they knew she existed. While the department scrambled to control the fallout, she had already pulled every thread. What looked like a single incident was actually part of a massive, long-buried pattern. And now, the entire city was watching it unravel. The official narrative collapsed when Camille released the second report, not through the Bureau, but directly to a federal oversight committee. It outlined how not just Officer Rigg, but multiple officers in the East Haven precinct had been protected, promoted, and shielded from consequence through deliberate acts of suppression, complaints that vanished, dashcam footage misplaced, medical reports rewritten, and most damning, a secret memo between precinct supervisors that read, "Let's keep this quiet. We've covered worse." That memo hit national headlines in less than an hour. News anchors called it explosive. Civil rights attorneys called it expected. The department called it misinterpreted, but Camille wasn't done, because now she had the green light to go after the ones who let this happen, not just the cops on the street, but the ones behind the desks, the ones with pens instead of badges, bureaucrats in suits who thought as long as they smiled for the cameras, no one would see the rot beneath. And here's where the real twist unfolded. Camille wasn't just trying to expose brutality. She was there to expose how it survives. Through silence, through culture, through people who say, "I didn't see anything," when they saw everything. She built a case not just against Officer Rigg, who was now suspended and awaiting criminal indictment, but against his commanding officer, the Internal Affairs Lieutenant, and even a city legal advisor who had repeatedly denied access to citizen complaints. The DOJ opened a formal investigation. But the moment that shifted the entire trajectory, Camille testified, not as a hidden agent, not undercover, not as a nameless woman thrown against a wall, but as Camille Rhodes' special agent, Division of Civil Oversight and Internal Reform, Federal Bureau of Investigation. She stood in front of a packed courtroom and said, "I was placed here to see whether your systems were broken. I no longer believe that. I believe they're working exactly as they were designed to protect each other, not the people." And you could hear the silence stretch. The city tried to discredit her, said she tainted the process, said she used entrapment. But there was no entrapment. There was just accountability and a camera that caught Rigg doing exactly what he'd probably done before. Only this time, to the wrong woman. And that was the turning point, because for once, the victim wasn't silenced. She was standing at the mic with receipts. The FBI followed with their own statement, backing Camille publicly. "Our agent acted with integrity. Her exposure of civil rights violations aligns with the agency's core mission." Suddenly, politicians were tripping over themselves to show support. The mayor launched a citywide trust initiative. The police chief went on indefinite leave, and multiple officers quietly resigned before disciplinary action could begin. But for Camille, this wasn't about career milestones or headlines. It was about a 15-year-old girl she once watched get berated on a sidewalk for talking back to a cop who had grabbed her first. It was about the countless citizens who had stories just like that. But no camera, no badge, and no one listening. That's why, even after the trial ended and the cameras moved on, she didn't stop. She joined town halls, not as an agent, as a voice. She worked with city council to fund trauma recovery programs for victims of police abuse, helped launch a public database where citizens could anonymously report misconduct, one that couldn't be edited by the department. And most importantly, she listened to the mothers who said they feared letting their sons walk to school in hoodies, to the kids who said they flinched at sirens even when they did nothing wrong, to the officers. Yes, even them who quietly admitted they were tired of being told to shut up and follow orders when they knew their own partners crossed the line. Camille didn't just break the silence. She replaced it with something louder truth. It wasn't flashy. It didn't always make headlines. But it was real. And the twist, in the end, wasn't that she brought a department down. It was that she held a mirror up and made them see themselves, not who they pretended to be, who they actually were. And that was the beginning of change. They say justice is blind, but it rarely feels that way when you're the one being judged before you speak. When you're a black woman walking through the world, authority doesn't always see a citizen. Sometimes it only sees a threat. But in this story, they picked the wrong target. Camille Rhodes wasn't just another name, another case, another body on the evening news. She was the system's mirror, and she didn't flinch when it cracked. And what happened in that precinct wasn't just about one officer losing control. It was about a culture that trains itself to stay silent, a culture that writes over truth until it sounds official. But what Camille showed us is this silence isn't safety. Silence is complicity. This story hit close for a lot of us, because we've all seen versions of it before. Maybe not in the headlines, maybe not on video, but we've felt it. In the tension when a siren sounds behind us. In the way people shift in elevators when we walk in with confidence. In the quiet warning that says, don't make it harder for yourself. But here's the thing. Camille made it harder on purpose. She risked being doubted, dismissed, even destroyed. Not because she wanted a badge of honor, but because she knew something bigger was at stake. Dignity, truth, the right to not just survive, but be seen. And that's the part I carry with me as the voice behind this channel, because we don't tell these stories to stir outrage. We tell them to light a fire under the silence, to remind you that every time someone chooses courage over comfort, something shifts, even if it's just 1 inch at a time. Camille didn't bring down a system, but she cracked it enough for light to get in, enough for others to say, maybe we don't have to play along anymore. And in a world that often punishes the truth-tellers harder than the rule-breakers, that is no small thing. So if you're still watching, thank you for making space for a story like this, for caring enough to stay to the end. And if this hit home for you, like it did for me, don't let it stop here. Talk about it. Share it. Let it live beyond the screen. And if you're new here, or you've been listening quietly in the background, now's the time. Hit subscribe. Join a community that refuses to let stories like this fade. Because silence has had the mic for too long. Let's change that, one story at a time. Radio Life Stories.